The average Joe guitar player
Yeah.
knows the Dumble story. Guy makes crazy amp that artists love that no mortal human can try. And even if you do, I've played one. And my favorite thing is if you played one, the first thing you're told is like, but by the way, no other one will ever sound like this one, which does you no good as a reference. Hey everyone, on this bonus Know Your Gear podcast, we're going to be talking to Taylor Cox, the designer and owner of Amplified Nation, an amplifier that is inspired by those iconic Dumble amplifiers. We're going to be learning about Dumbles, his amps, and maybe even a little bit more. What did you hear in the amps that you love, and how did you kind of make sure your amps had that or improved upon it? Like, take us down the sound of your amps more so than just the specs.
Yeah. So when I started Amplified Nation, it was a cabinet business, and I was building custom cabinets. I was actually out of my basement and with a table saw and everything like that for a lot of amp builders. And as I expanded the business, I started doing kind of replacement cabinets for like Two Rocks and Bluto Tones. And I really kind of dove into that Dumble thing. I just love the sound. I love how the amps were very musical. I loved how the overdrive was organic. I love the feeling that I got when I played those amps. And through that experience of building all those cabinets, I got to play like some of the best amps in the world. And, it was a lot of clones. And then guys started sending me real Dumbles too. So I really got like a different kind of experience where I wasn't just like looking at schematics and listening to YouTube videos and things like that. Like I actually was able to experience the amp and like hear the timbre characteristics of how it's supposed to sound and how it felt, right?
Right.
And back then, when I started building my own amps, you'd mentioned before about like really trying to clone something and like how close can I get to like a real Dumble? And that's definitely what I was trying to do. But what I found is like you're saying now, like you kind of develop your own ear and you get to the point where you're like, all right, great. Like I can hear this circuit, how can I make it like the most, organically, connection that you can have like with your guitar. So you start developing an ear for it. And I think that ends up kind of being more important than the circuit in the end, because then you start messing around with different component types. What are you using? Where are you using it? Where are you putting the wires? And, you develop your own sound and your own style. And then you have an amp line that, I can't say any of my amps are exact clones anymore. Like I'm not even really sure where they're at. I know they sound great, to me, and I know people like them. So I know that, my ear has been able to connect with other people and really kind of, allow them to experience the same thing that I did, so, that's kind of where I'm at now, is I've got 4 or 5 different amps. Yeah, they have Dumble lineage. Some of them, like my Steel String Singer, are going to sound awful like Stevie Ray Vaughan, or the amps I have that are more like focused on the Mayer sound, they're going to sound like John Mayer, but they're going to have a little bit of a difference. You know what I mean? They're going to be my interpretation of that sound. So it may not be exact, but it's a great amp.
So I see now you have 7 amplifiers. We're going to start with the first 2, the Dirty Wonderland and the Wonderland Overdrive V2. Why I want to talk about those 2 together is not because they have the same name, because their price point is sub $3,500. Mm-hmm. So this is essentially like, what do you get when you go with those 2 amps? What is it?
The Dirty Wonderland is a fantastic amplifier. It's a single channel clean amp. So no overdrive. It's got a beautiful reverb with 2 knobs on it. You can control the depth of the reverb and the level back into the mix. And that amp really does like the John Mayer clean sound. So it's got a EQ like a Fender Super Reverb, but it stays together a bit tighter. It's got some additional power filtering that really kind of give it some beefiness. And it added some dirty switches in the back that allow you to break up the amp at kind of lower levels. A lot of my customers, even the guys that gig, like they want an amp that will work well at home. They want amp that they can play when their kids are sleeping. So I tried to make the amps so they had enough get up to like, get over a drummer if you're at a gig, but you can also take them home and dial in a great low volume sound. So those dirty switches give you some additional kind of hair on the notes, or like you were saying before, right when you start digging into a clean tone, can you get that just tad bit of breakup? Generally speaking, if you're in a single channel amp, you got to turn it up pretty loud. So that amp has the dirty switches that allow the amp kind of loosen up a little bit, get that edge of breakup, the hair on the notes. Fantastic amp. Works really great with pedals too. So that's really like the Mayer tone. It's kind of modeled after some of the early two rock amps that I experienced, when I first started building, and I kind of did my own take on it. So it's not exactly a clone of a two rock, but it kind of does that early '80s kind of Dumble. It's a low plate classic preamp.
Right.
The Wonderland Overdrive was an amp that I designed shortly after the Dirty Wonderland. And I had a lot of guys saying, hey, you got this amp, but it doesn't have an overdrive. Can you get that clean sound, but have an overdrive channel? So I kept the clean channel the same, which, is why it's the Wonderland series. And then I added an overdrive onto it, which was definitely still in the kind of Dumble Overdrive special realm. Early '80s tone, which is kind of a raw sort of tone. It's not like the really compressed sound of Robin Ford, with the chirp and the saxophoniness. It's kind of raw and uncompressed, more like Stevie Ray Vaughan or Mayer. The overdrive on that amp is real throaty. It's pretty beefy. I tried to get that to kind of sound like the early Bonamassa tone. And I retained the reverb, although it's not the same circuit as the Dirty Wonderland. It's got a reverb built in and a half power. So that amp's, foot switchable, 2 channels, and does a great clean and dirty thing. That's what was in Rhett's video. It's one of his favorite amps.
Right.
It's been my bestseller by far, which is kind of ironic because it's probably the furthest amp away from being a real Dumble that I sell. Where it was.
Oh, go on.
Kind of like I just took a few different ideas and put them together, and I designed that amp a long time ago. Like it was probably 2015, maybe 16. I've made some improvements along the way, definitely with like putting it together and how it's constructed. You just kind of learn as you go along. You figure out what breaks, what can withstand, being on a tour bus for 5 or 6 weeks, or what needs to be improved here and there. So I definitely made some improvements, but that's a fantastic amp. So both of those amps do a lot of different things. There's a little more flexibility with the Wonderland Overdrive because of the second channel. But the guy, some guys that come in, they only want the clean sound. A lot of guys just want clean. They want to hit it with a pedal if they want some breakup. But people don't play with a lot of gain. So I do sell the Dirty Wonderland pretty frequently as well. It's a very, warm kind of forgiving amp that sounds a lot like a vintage Fender, but you get the quality of a boutique amp and that additional power filtering that, kind of holds it together a little bit better than the vintage stuff.
It's funny now. I didn't even connect until you were talking that it's called the Wonderland, and you were talking about the John Mayer tone. I'm like, oh yeah, he has a song like Your Body is a Wonderland.
There you go.
Yep.
Yeah. So when I was first getting into amp building and I started finding out about like all the Dumble stuff, I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but a lot of those Dumbles were gooped. So the circuits were covered in epoxy and hardened or silicone. So no one actually knew what the circuit was. And that's what became like became so much drama around it because everybody wanted to know what was in the amp. You couldn't figure it out. I mean, the Fender stuff, like there were schematics everywhere. It was a mass-produced product. It had to have people that could fix it. You know what I mean? So a lot of that information was very public. But the Dumble stuff, well, a couple different reasons, I guess. So obviously he was trying to keep the design secret. So he would goop the amps or he would silicone them. In some cases, I think he would even use components that, may have drifted. So he would measure out a resistor that if you look, the resistors are all color coded. So it may have been a 100K resistor, but it was 10 or 15 years old. And the value is actually 120K or,
Right.
So it could have been a little bit different, but all the amps were also, somewhat custom, so Dumble number 119 was probably not exactly the same as Dumble number 120. So nobody really knew, what was in the amps. And there was so much drama around it that it just kind of like drew me in. And I know there were some guys, back in, it was before I started, it wasn't even close to, building amps at the time, probably 2002, 2003. That's when guys like Bill Kernard of Two Rock and Andy Fuchs and a couple of the other guys got into some of those amps and de-gooped them and really figured out what it was. And they also kept those designs secret. So there was even, more kind of drama around, you know, like you were saying before, like, did they get it right? Do they know what's actually inside it? And then, you know, they were grouping their amps, or, you know, putting Sharpies all over the components so you couldn't tell what the value was. And all that drama kind of led to that being like where all the money was going, you know? So when I started building, which was 2011, 2012, maybe a little bit before then, but when I started building professionally, you know, I was like, hey, that's where I want to go. Like, you know, the train wreck stuff was cool and kind of the same, where it was the super high end boutique stuff, but there wasn't any of the secretism. There wasn't any of the drama. There wasn't guys, you know, trying to go in, you know, and grab an amp from Santana and then degoop it before he's going to get back to the show the next day. You know what I mean? Like crazy stuff like that. But it really drew me in, and, you know, obviously the amps are great too, but, you know, that whole thing was just kind of sexy.
What I found is that just like a guitar, an amp needs to speak to you. You plug into it and it has to, like, it inspires you.
Mhm.
And we even started this thing on the podcast years ago, because I was getting sick of, and I still am sick of, I don't like any kind of videos of any kind that are like, the audience can't tell.
Yeah.
The analogy I've used forever is, well, a chef can have $1,000 knife, and you can't tell when you eat his food that he used
Mhm.
$1,000 knife. So the knife wasn't for you; it was for him.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Right. The artist decides what matters to them. Their
Yeah.
job is to make the audience have a great experience, whether that's through a Hot Rod Deluxe or an Amplified Nation amp. That's the whole point. And when I talk to musicians and they're like, I can just use a Hot Rod Deluxe and a tube screamer, I'm like, that's great. And
Mhm.
if that works for you, I'm glad, and mostly glad, because obviously that's a more affordable rig. Talk about it, easier on your pocketbook and on the stress of not worrying about it getting stolen.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I mean, the super high end gear too, like, you know, Johan Gustafsson,
Yes.
he's a Swedish builder.
Yeah.
So I heard about his guitars for years, and everyone always said that they inspired creativity, you
Right.
know, and I was like, come on, you know, like, I don't believe it. And I got one, and I still have it. And I traded like two R9s for it and like an amp. Like, it was insane. But I remember I got it and I sat down with it, and there was a couple nights and a couple moments that I specifically remember when I was like, oh, like, I get it now. You
Yeah.
know, this is definitely like, because it does inspire you a little bit. And it's not the price of the instrument. I mean, that might have something to do with it, where you're really like expecting that to happen, but
Right.
it's the feeling, you know what I mean? It's like how it plays and stuff. And you're like, man, like, this is doing things that I want it to without that much effort, you know? And
Yeah.
it's the same thing with the amp. And I've had a couple real Dumbles in my shop for some of them for a few months. Number 38, which was amazing. It was a 70s overdrive special. And I remember it's kind of the same thing where you're sitting down with it and you're like, man, this amp is doing exactly what I want it to. Like, it sounds like like, you know, some of my favorite artists. It's actually doing it, and it's doing it for me, you know. And it almost feels like, especially with the amp, like the guitar is obvious because you're like, well, I'm playing the guitar. It's in my hands. I can feel it. It's tangible. The amp isn't that tangible, right? It's the sound and it's just some knobs. Like, but what I want to do is, like, I want someone when they sit down with the amp to actually feel like they're playing a second instrument. You know what I mean? Like, where
Yes.
you're actually playing the amp and the guitar is like a remote control, you know?
Yes.
And that does kind of inspire that creativity. Like I said, like, when you're like playing it, you're like, man, like, this amp is doing like what I want it to, and the guitar is doing what I want it to, and it sounds awesome, and I'm not having to work that hard.
I 100% agree. I think it takes every musician, unfortunately, a long time to realize that what they're really searching for is a great clean tone. Um,
That's where you got to start.
that's where you got to start.
Yeah.
The uh,
And one
well,
thing with the Dumble amps too, it's like they're cascading preamps like the Marshalls. So the clean channel is always being played. So when you switch over to the overdrive, your
right.
clean channel is still on. You're still playing through the clean channel. The clean channel just feeds into the overdrive tube and then into the power amp. So you got to start with a great clean. And the crazy thing is, like, what's great for clean isn't always great for your overdrive. So then you got to balance it out you know, so you want to retain the great quality. So you have a, you know, beautiful, clean sound, but, you know, how can you dial your clean in? So when you do stack it with your overdrive, that's also a very musical, you know, great experience.
Let's go to the next three. So it's the ampliphonics,
Yeah.
right?
Ampliphonics
Okay.
and gain.
And then the bombshell overdrive and the steel strings Sultan. And the reason I picked those three, again, because we're hitting, this is $3,500, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I'd say is the next next level up. I know they're all different, and it's really kind of horrible to have them classified like this.
Yeah.
But I really want to talk to the fact that I really want to talk to the viewer who's like, I'm thinking about getting into this, you know, this is the next step, the evolution of like, okay, I've had all these other amps. Now I really want to get this real high-end amp. What am I looking at? And so on those three amps at $3,500, let's go through them in that order. The ampliphonics and gain.
Let's switch up the order. Let's do the bombshell first. So
okay, perfect.
The bombshell overdrive is basically our version of the Dumble Overdrive Special. So it's a very simple 3 preamp tube amp. It has a clean and an overdrive. It's foot switchable, and it has a preamp boost that is also on the foot switch and hits both channels. That amp I modeled after, you know, we talked about the Wonderland series. That's like an early 80s Dumble sound, very kind of uncompressed and raw. The bombshell is a later version Dumble sound, like a late 80s, and that is definitely more of the Robin Ford, Larry Carlton sound. So it's real chewy. It's got a little more compression. You know, it's kind of honky in a way. It really sounds like a saxophone when you get into it. Great amp, but definitely like a little simpler than the amps that have reverb. Real stout and stuff. Fantastic. The steel string Sultan is another just clean amp. So that's a single channel clean amp. That is kind of based off of the steel string singer that Stevie Ray Vaughan made so popular. And now Mayer is also playing one of those. That amp is more like a of aggressive sort of clean. So like a clean lead sort of sound, where the amp almost exhibits some like overdriven qualities without the overdrive. So you get a little bit more sustain, you get a little, you know, more touch sensitivity, you know, where you can even hear the flesh in your fingertips. You can hear the slightest little touch of pick attack. So that's a really great amp, but definitely more aggressive than like the Dirty Wonderland. So it's a little more biting. It sounds kind of more hi-fi. It's got a tube in the overdrive that's called a cathode follower, which really kind of kicks the output of the amp up without giving it distortion. So it doesn't really make it louder, and it doesn't give it more gain. It's just like, it's almost like, I always think about like a turbo in a car, you know? So it just kind of gives it a little bit more power. You may not be going any faster, but you can get there quicker. And then the ampliphonics and gain is completely different. So that amp is really cool. It's got 2 independent preamps. So it's got a clean and an overdrive. It's not cascading. So if you plug into the clean, you plug it into the clean, or if you plug into the drive, it's 2 completely different amps that share the power amp. So you're obviously going to share your 6L6 or your L34 power tubes. That amp, the gain side is like a modded Marshall. So it's super high gain, real beefy. It does anything from classic rock all the way to hard rock or metal tones, and just a wild experience. The clean side is based off of a Fender Basement, and it's a different kind of Dumble style amp that he called the Ultraphonics. So I call it the Ampliphonics, just like a little play on words. And it's like the best Fender Basement clean you've ever heard. So it's got a little bit more gain, breaks up earlier, but still has a good amount of headroom. But it does this really cool kind of like swirly kind of, just like, it almost sounds like a rotary speaker. It's not like that, but it's like, it does this kind of thing where it's like almost breathing like it's alive. It's pretty cool. And both sides do that. So that amp is awesome. Channel switching, and I put reverb on it as well.
What's interesting about that is you said like a trigger word, Fender Basement. That's one of my favorite amps. Everybody, right? You can't even claim that because everybody loves a Fender Basement. To me, a Fender Basement, you always want one, but you want with reverb. So so the fact that it's basically like that, like you said, you'll get that Fender Basement clean, which to me, that clean is punchy.
Yeah.
That's what I love about it. It
And
thumps
loud.
and
too.
loud.
Yeah.
Like some people, we use all these weird terms, right? All of us, some people want that clean that's like the top end sparkle, it's chimey, right? I'm never looking for that. I'm looking for the clean where I call it the snap, right? Like the pick hits it, and I want deliberately everybody to know like that just happened, right?
Yeah.
Right. So if I'm doing a pick through, if I'm hitting a chord, if I'm muting and like I want everything to be very more percussive, and that's what I love about the Basement. But I kind of need reverb. Reverb is a crutch for me, like a lot of players. I put a little reverb because the washiness of the reverb adds kind of this element of sustain and kind of it doesn't put you so much in the front of the mix. Playing without reverb is like standing on stage with no clothes to me. It's like all of a sudden I'm very aware of everything.
Yeah, it's really hard to hide behind.
Yeah, and so it's amazing that you had the reverb to it. Think of it like that way. That's a great way to talk to someone that's looking for that sound, because a lot of players are looking for the old Basement heads. And to be honest with you, like one of the problems I have is a lot of the old ones that you find on Reverb and stuff. I mean, they've always been recapped, obviously retubed, all kinds of stuff. A lot of them been modded and then put back, and you don't know what was done to them. And let's face it, like a lot of amps that are old, some are great and some weren't so great.
Yeah, it's like buying a vintage car. You know what I mean? You don't want to drive that as your daily driver.
Yes.
It's gonna break down, and you don't know where it's been. You don't have a service history on it, things like that. I do love those amps, especially those old, like the JMP Marshalls and stuff. Oh my God, so good. But yeah, you just can't always depend on it.
Yeah. So like I said, you never know what you're gonna get. So what's interesting is the Bombshell to me and the Steel String Sultan. Those are what's interesting is when I think of the two most Dumble clone pedals, those are the two amps that are those. So if you're into those two, like especially like Vertex, is that Vertex that does them, right? There's a
definitely.
So that's what's great about that is if you're into those pedals, if you think those pedals sound good, this would be like let's step up and get into the real deals.
Those are my most Dumble-y amps, especially the Bombshell. That really, does the Robin Ford sort of thing. It's one of my favorites, and I'm a big reverb guy. Like I don't like to play without reverb. I'll put a pedal in the loop or something. But that amp, man, it gets so chewy, like especially with humbuckers. It's a different type of feeling, and it sounds like when you watch these guys play, like Bonamassa or Robin, when they hit those kind of lower registers on the guitar, and there's just like a breath to it.
Oh yeah.
That you don't normally hear. That's what that amp does. And that's what it does, special. That's kind of what it is. And same thing with the Steel String Sultan. I actually have two versions of that. We just re-released the Steel String Singer, which is pretty much the same amp as the Sultan, but it's got some foot switchable features and some different ways to boost the amp with a preamp boost and also a FET input, which is a higher gain input. But that amp is also like, that really does like the Stevie Ray Vaughan sort of thing, or kind of like an Eric Johnson sort of tone. You throw pedals at it, it does some really great stuff. But when you get that amp boosted, like we've been building the Singer, which is kind of it's a bigger, the Overdrive Reverb that I sent you, that's my large chassis, and I made the new amp, the Steel String Singer, that same size. So it's kind of like imposing a little bit. It can't sit on top of a 1x12 cabinet unless it's oversized. It's a big amp,
right?
But it looks cool. And we've been building them here over the past like month or two. I got some pre-production ones that went out to some of the YouTube guys and stuff. And we're going to be building the production ones next week. But that amp, man, with like the way we've been boosting it, like I like let my guys like take like 30 minutes out of their day. And I was like, you guys got to go play this thing, because it was like an experience. I got a big warehouse here with a pretty large garage. And we jam in the garage because there's another warehouse above it, and we can make a lot of noise out there. And we had that thing cranked up, and it was like a stack of Marshalls, and it was wild because it wasn't like what you'd think of from a single channel clean amp, because that amp has a ton of headroom. It gets real loud. It stays real clean. But when you boost it in just the right way, it's kind of like a natural boost. It's not like an overdrive pedal is in front of the amp. it's like single channel, like what some of those old Marshalls single channels, like the
Oh yeah.
2203,
Yeah. Yeah.
2204. It's
Yes.
that sort of thing where you've got like this insane amount of preamp breakup and also power tube overdrive where you're like, oh my God, this is the best guitar tone I've ever heard. You know, you just can't even put your finger on what's happening. Yeah, those have been, you know, really fun to play the past couple months. I can't remember where I was going with this, but yeah, those two amps are definitely my most Dumble focused stuff.
The way I look at it now is, to me, the Dirty Wonderland and the Wonderland Overdrive 2, to me, is like perfect. It's like, okay, I don't use pedals, but I love a good clean amp. So to me, like the Wonderland Overdrive 2 sounds like the better choice for me, because I want a great clean, but I'm probably not likely to plug an overdrive in. I'm not really a pedal guy.
And I like the reverb on board. I like having both channels. You know, maybe I use a pedal here or there. I can put a delay in the loop. Yeah, definitely. Swiss Army knife style amp does a lot of different things. You know, if you only had one amp, you could Wonderland Overdrive V2 would be a great choice.
Now, the one you sent me is the Overdrive Reverb, and that's the one I've been checking out. I would say out of all your amps, just looking at them, this one has probably the biggest learning curve because there was so much to do.
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to manipulate the volume. Because it's got the ratio controls in the back, which act as master volumes for each channel. So each channel has a gain knob, and each channel has a master, which is the ratio control. And then the amp also has the level control in the front, which is the global master, which determines how much of your preamp is sent to your power amp. So that actually controls the overall volume of the amp. So it allows you to scale. But because the amp is cascading, like we were talking about before, the clean channel is always on. So the louder you have the clean, the more saturated your overdrive becomes. So, you know, you can dial just so many different gain structures and different tones in. And it definitely can be a bit of a learning curve, or take a couple of days to kind of really figure out, you know, where you put your clean, or how loud to set your clean ratio control, you know. And then again, like, you know, depending on where that's set, it flavors your overdrive differently. So then you may need to adjust your overdrive gain or your overdrive volume. So yeah, man, it can definitely be a bit of a learning curve. But once you master it, like I'm sure you figured it out after a while. You're like, okay, like it's easy.
This seemed to be a really like over the top tool for somebody who's literally knows exactly what they want, and they're going to find it. Like there's no way somebody couldn't find a tone out of this thing. There's just no way. So is that what it is that was just all the years of making that amps, the other amps, you're like, okay, I'm going to make this? And
I always wanted to make that amp. It's there's very little known about that circuit. You know, a lot of the Dumble stuff, you can get schematics online. You know, there's websites like the Amp Garage where you can go on and build your own Dumble. But nobody really knows what was in the Overdrive Reverb. So I was given the chance to check one out and was able to reverse engineer it, and then added my kind of own flavor. And, you know, our kind of, you know, there's different components that are available now than there was when Dumble was building. Obviously, you can't get, you know, vintage, what are they, Q-line resistors and tires and, you know, old Sprague orange drops and stuff like that. You can't find some of that stuff anymore. It's not available. You know, there was new old stock that you could buy back in 2014, 2013. Those supplies have all dried up. So there's some guys that have them, but you know, a lot of the stuff we use is just new production stuff. And it's what everybody's using in the industry, you know, they're really high end amp builders. But the Overdrive Reverb is definitely like, that's kind of the best of everything. You know, it's got the great cleans, the great overdrive, and I love reverb, you know, so that has the huge reverb that some of my amps have, like the Dirty Wonderland or the Steel String Singer, where you have two knobs where you can set the depth of the reverb and the level of the reverb in the mix. But it just kind of has a brilliance that amps like the Wonderland Overdrive or the Bombshell don't really have. And I think some of it is to do with the amount of preamp tubes that are in that amp. Did you see how many are in the back?
No, I didn't.
There's 6 preamp tubes.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's a lot. And they're not like dedicated to, you know, trem or anything like that. There's obviously a pretty elaborate reverb circuit, but there's mixers and things like that kind of give that amp a little bit more brilliance and breadth that you don't get with some of the other models. So it's definitely, you know, a flagship product for us. and it's just a fantastic sounding amp. That's I sent one to Joe Bonamassa a couple years ago, and he absolutely loved it. Used it on a couple recording sessions and played it live and stuff. And I sold a few amps for us, but it's been a great product.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's an impressive amp. You never know when you're trying something. You're like, I know it's going to be. I assumed. I'm like, it's got to be good.
Yeah.
And then
the balls to charge 4K.
Yeah, well, that's why I said it's to me the price is never like the determining factor if it's good. But at some price, you're like, well, obviously we know, it's good. It's what is unique about it. What is it? Why do you need this? What are you missing out on if you don't go with it? And I also had the hindsight of knowing that essentially a lot of amplifiers, more companies now spend more time making amplifiers good enough. At some point, amps get to the point where it's like, okay, let's stop trying to figure out how to make an amp even better. Let's try to figure out how to make an amp under $1,000.
Or how can I make 2,000 of these a year?
Yeah. Or how, right. Yeah. Yes. How can I make 2,000 a year? Sometimes when players are playing good amps, because they're good, those mass produced amps are good. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you get so used to them that when you plug into something a little bit more top shelf, like I said, you don't notice it until you take it back away again. Like I said, I love that. Same with compressors. I used to have to, on videos, everybody's talking about compressors, and I finally learned to trick compressors. Play with one for a little while, turn it off.
Yeah.
Then you'll notice what it did. Everybody used it the opposite way. They turned it on and go, I don't know what it's doing. I'm like, well, play and then wait till it goes away and you'll notice something changed. So very interesting. So thank you.
I would love to make like a lower end, 10 or 15 watt amp that kind of did some of these things. But, maybe that's down the road. Right now, we're still hand building everything, one at a time, voicing them here in house. I'm testing everything and, making sure everything sounds right and tuning all the amps before they go out. So, we're really trying to keep our attention to detail as tight as possible and, make a really quality product that people love.
Well, for whatever insight it's worth, I think the future really is going to be very good amplifiers that are made really well, and then modeling and profiling. And the problem, because here's the question, this is the $1 million question, doesn't pertain to you, but I have interviewed so many other amp companies that I have to ask them, right? There's questions I have to ask you and questions I ask them. One of the questions I ask them is, if your amp is just good, not great, it's just good, so is the Kemper.
Yeah.
So is the Axe Effects. Those are good too. When we start arguing 10%, right? This amp is 10% better in real life than the facsimile, so to speak. It's not enough sometimes to keep people.
Point?
Yeah. What's the point? The real hard question, which is what I think the future comes down to, is, do I want 10 really good amps? Or do I want 2 magical amps and then a profiler or a modeler modeling all those other amps that I don't really need that often or don't use that often? And to be honest with you, I can get 75 to 80% there with the model technology. And that's why I thought it'd be cool to have you come on and talk about them. And I, by the way, I'm hoping when people watch this, they'll have an epiphany, because I had 2 epiphanies while you were talking. So
I really appreciate the opportunity to come on.
Oh, no, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Oh, I got to ask before we leave, why is the company called Amplified Nation?
I came up with that name. My wife and I came up with that name probably back in 2009 when we first started the business. And I cannot remember the reason why. I was doing Tolex repair and restoration off of Craigslist. We lived really close to Boston, and we came up with our first website. We were like, what should we call it? And I was like, Amplified Nation, and it just stuck. We never changed it. So it's been the name of the company. And it's really tough to put on a logo, because it's 2 words, but I've always just liked the name. So we stuck with it.
I was like, just thinking about that going, I didn't even ask. I know. So I could hear, you could hear the comments. Hey, why is it called that? So thank you, Taylor, for coming on and joining us. And I want to thank everybody for watching. And as always, thank them for their time. And until the next time, know your gear.
Really appreciate it, Phil. Thank you.
You're welcome.